I'm going to tell you a little bit about carbon literacy and a little bit about COP and a little bit about why museums and galleries are involved in today's day, in today's focus day. So first of all, what is carbon literacy? Some of you may already be very familiar with it. You may never have come across the concept before. But basically, carbon literacy is a low carbon culture change project, which we started almost 9 years ago now. But carbon literacy is basically a day's worth of learning about climate change. One of the things that's unusual about carbon literacy are some of the qualities and the unique qualities that it carries with it. So as an example, we're a not-for-profit organisation. The Carbon Literacy Project is owned by the Carbon Literacy Trust, which is a registered charity. Carbon literacy was started when we pulled together a working group of 30 people, drawn from all walks of life, all sorts of organisations, who all collaborated together to create a definition for the term carbon literacy, and then created a standard that described a day's worth of learning about low carbon futures that would work in all contexts. So it would be both consistent for all these different types of organisations, yet at the same time adapted for all those organisations. And this approach was unique. It was a not-for-profit approach. It was a collaborative approach with people from all walks of life working together. The training materials would be consistent everywhere, yet adapted everywhere. And the delivery model was non-centralized. So there was no training company or training organization sitting behind this. All the participant organizations could pick up the materials and deliver them themselves. And most importantly, it led directly to action. It wasn't a passive piece of learning. Carbon literacy is a very active piece of learning, where you start your learning and then at the end of the day, you take or commit to an action as an individual and an action as a wider group of people. And as a result, carbon literacy starts to form part of the solution to climate change that we all seek. One of the other things that's unique about carbon literacy is the way that it transcends sectors and works at scale. So as I'm recording this now, just before the COP climate negotiations are about to begin, 23,000 people have undertaken this pathway already and have therefore generated 46,000 actions drawn from all walks of life, from all sectors, but all designed to reduce our carbon footprint and begin to address the challenge of climate change. So what is COP26? So COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It's the United Nations bringing together, almost without exception, every nation in the world to agree, hopefully, an agreement between nations as to how we collectively deal with climate change, reduce our carbon emissions, and pay for that process. Climate change is the biggest existential threat threatening mankind probably in our entire history. And this meeting is arguably one of the most important meetings in human history. If we get an agreement at COP, it can make a material difference to the way we deal with things. If we don't, it's going to be incredibly difficult. So it's a vital meeting. The Carbon Literacy Project has been invited by the UN as an official observer organisation. So that's one of the reasons that we're involved. But we've chosen to use that opportunity to showcase all the different action that's happening on climate change. So each day of the COP conference, we're working with a different sector that we work with. We're working with local authorities and universities, social housing, the automotive industry, communities and corporates. And one of those audiences is museums and galleries. So why museums and galleries? Well, you probably know better than I do the role of museums and galleries in society, both to entertain, but also to educate, to inform people, but also inspire them, to use some of the things found and created in the past to inspire and hopefully shape a better future. And that happens both in the real world, in physical spaces, and increasingly in the virtual world. So why would museums as cultural institutions not want to engage with this huge existential threat? We started working some 5 or 6 years ago now with Manchester Museum and Museum Development Northwest, who created a carbon literacy training course, which they then rolled out. The museum became a carbon literate organisation and then a carbon literate training organisation, and started collaborating with museums and galleries across the UK. In the meantime, we had been funded as a project by government to create toolkits for various areas of the public sector, including actually government itself. And seeing this, Lindsay Jones at Manchester Museum said that there's a space and demand for a toolkit for the museums and gallery sector. So applied to the Arts Council, and fortunately was successful in that funding bid, and that's led to a project called Roots and Branches, of which this training course is part.
Hi, I'm Kay from Museum Development Northwest, and I'm going to tell you a bit about our role in supporting museums with environmental sustainability. Museum Development Northwest is part of a wider network of museum development teams across England, funded by Arts Council England through the Museum Development Programme to support museums in each of the 9 English regions. We're also part of a wider network across the UK, working with museum development providers in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. Museum Development Northwest has been supporting museums to tackle their environmental impacts for over a decade through various Green Museums programmes and grants. And in 2016, we worked with Manchester Museum and the Carbon Literacy Project to develop a carbon literacy course for museums. This was used to train staff at Manchester Museum, and they became the world's first carbon literate museum. And we became one of the first carbon literacy training organisations. The carbon literacy training became part of our core programme from 2017 to 2020. And we soon saw that the demand for the training across the sector was more than that we could support on our own. And the urgency for action against climate change was growing. So in 2021, we worked with Manchester Museum, the Carbon Literacy Project and museum development teams across England to develop Roots and Branches, a project designed to accelerate environmental action in the sector. And we're pleased to say we were successful in receiving lottery funding from Arts Council England for the project. So what is Roots and Branches? Well, the roots of the project will take place at Manchester Museum, where a new post will be created to support the development of a cultural co-working environmental hub on the 3rd floor of the museum when it reopens after redevelopment. The hub will bring together museums, educators, environmentalists, artists, researchers, third sector organisations and students, with the aim to help the sector see how we can grow back greener, encouraging communities and individuals to take environmental action, and also to highlight to stakeholders, including local authorities, government, funders, and the wider cultural sector, how museums are fulfilling their environmental responsibilities. The branches of the project will see the launch of a new museum-specific carbon literacy toolkit in January 2022, which will be free to access by all museums through the Carbon Literacy Project website and enable museums to roll out the training in their organisations. Museum development teams across England will also deliver regional carbon literacy courses over 18 months, supported by a new museum carbon literacy officer, Alison Criddle. The branches of the project aims to train 1,500 people from across 300 museums in carbon literacy, with each delegate making their own individual and organisational pledges to take action. We'll also be promoting the opportunity for museums to get involved in the environmental hub at Manchester Museum. There's also a social media campaign, #MuseumCarbonStories, that has been running from August on the run up to and during COP26, where we've invited museums to use collections to communicate issues of climate change and also highlight what actions they've been taking to mitigate their own impact. Museum development teams across England have also been delivering other workshops and sessions to support environmental action too. And here's some examples. So if you want to know more about the project and how you can get involved at your museum, do feel free to contact us.
Hello, my name is Polly Bentham. I'm a senior officer in the Arts Council and I've recently joined the environmental responsibility team, so I'm excited to be here today. I'd like to thank the Carbon Literacy Project for inviting the Arts Council to speak at this event as part of the COP26 conference, the bold aim of which is uniting the world to tackle climate change. Leadership is needed on climate change and the environment. COP26 is ongoing as we speak, but leadership doesn't need to come solely from government. Leadership can come from sectors, organisations at all levels, communities and individuals, and that includes the creative and cultural sector. Within the past 10 years, the Arts Council has made significant progress on environment and climate. We regularly fund around 800 organisations through our national portfolio, all of whom are required to make a commitment to the environment through environmental policies and action plans and regular reporting. Just 30 of those organisations, which include several museums, are responsible for approximately half the total carbon footprint of the portfolio. Through our Spotlight programme, we have worked with these organisations to set ambitious science-based targets to reduce their environmental impact. We've also introduced new programmes to support the sector, including the Accelerator programme that encourages innovation in environmental responsibility, and the Colour Green Lab, which empowers cultural practitioners and artists of colour to lead on environmental action. These are positive first steps, but we know we can do much more. In our 10-year strategy, Let's Create, published just before the pandemic, we increased our commitment to responding on environment and climate. We made environmental responsibility one of our 4 investment principles for the individuals and organisations that we fund. Whilst this may mean changes for those we fund, it has also required an inward focus. We want to provide leadership and support, but know we can also learn from the creative and cultural sector. We would very much like this to be a two-way process. We are now reviewing our own environmental responsibility and how we make sure this is built into everything we do as an arts funding body. We are also developing our own action plan and policy, which we will be announcing soon, so please take a look at our website. In addition, we are funding projects that look at how our festivals, theatres, libraries and museums can be greener, as well as piloting a new programme looking at making international touring more sustainable. We're investing in developing tools and resources to help the cultural sector improve forecasts and reporting of your environmental data, and also investing in research for the cultural sector with the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, led by Nesta. This is more positive progress, but in practice, what does environmental responsibility mean for museums? In Let's Create, we call for cultural organisations to lead the way in their approach to environmental responsibility. And it's a principle that requires consideration in relation not only to our national portfolio, but also other funding programmes, such as project grants or creative people and places. For museums, we appreciate environmental responsibility can relate to so many things. The buildings you inhabit, the care of your collections and loans, your local authority net zero plans, your digital footprint, touring exhibitions, your sponsors, audiences, communities and programming. The last may be the most valuable. As civic leaders, museums can offer an authentic voice. You can tell stories covering everything from the natural environment, social geography and the political landscape, to how we design, innovate and adapt, to how the planet could look in the future. You can use your collections to start conversations, connect communities and communicate knowledge in accessible and imaginative ways. You can act as incubators for change, provide platforms for debate and empower people. We recognise it's not going to be possible for museums to address all aspects of environmental responsibility at once. We understand that any actions you take will be influenced by the size and structure of your organisation, your venues, your collections, your audiences. We would ask you to think about where you could have the most impact and to consider both short-term goals as well as longer-term ambitions. And in relation to this, we're very happy to be able to support Roots and Branches, which is a trailblazing project that will enable the museums sector to respond to the climate emergency and help you deliver against environmental responsibility. Collectively, we can all draw on COP26 for hope and inspiration. But irrespective of the outcomes, it's time that we all take action. We believe museums can play a vital role in responding to the challenges we face on environment and climate.
Hi, so my name is Alex Smith and I'm the Climate Officer at Museums Galleries Scotland, and I'm here to talk about museums and climate change in Scotland and what museums in Scotland and what MGS are doing to help tackle climate change. So I'd first like to talk about the role of museums in climate change and I think the cultural and heritage sector firstly have a very important part to play in the fight against climate change. And no organisation is more important in this than museums, although I may be slightly biased in that. Museums themselves provide a safe space to learn. People come to a museum with the intention of learning, with an open mind. And part of our responsibility as an organisation is to welcome these people expecting no prior knowledge, no base level, and try to engage with them on whatever topic they've come in for, if that's climate change or something else completely. One of the strengths that museums and the cultural sector has as a whole in this approach is when it comes to climate change, it can bring what can feel like a distant polar bears on ice sheets problem that they can't do much about down to their local level, down to their environment, their area, and tied into their history, which I think can be a really powerful tool. And I'll talk more about this later through some of the case studies in the presentation. Practically speaking, museums can have kind of direct and or indirect action on climate change. And what I mean by this is for direct action, it's steps that they can take to limit their own emissions, to operate in a sustainable way and to reduce their carbon footprint as an organisation, which, given some of the buildings and collection management needed by museums, this can be quite a task in and of itself. While indirect actions are through utilising our unique role in influencing, engaging and shaping conversations with the wider public and community. So now I'm speaking to you today, not as an employee of a particular museum, but of Museums Galleries Scotland, which is the development body for museums in Scotland. And I'm currently just over about 3 months with the organisation in this role. And we carry out quite a wide and varied role, but broadly speaking, we look at ways to develop the sector, to upskill museums, to advocate for museums. And so I'll talk about specific examples of actions museums are taking throughout Scotland in the next slides, but I wanted to talk just briefly about MGS's role in climate change, as we have a kind of helicopter view of Scotland's museums, which I think is quite important to flag up. One of the things we do is to provide grants and funding to museums for a variety of different things, and sustainability and climate change have become one of our main operational priority areas in recent times. And so from this, we're encouraging responses to climate change through our regular grant funding opportunities. So for example, we've got through the Small Grants Fund, one of the 4 funding priorities is that it has to be activity to improve environmental sustainability. And for our larger museum development fund, one of the 14 desired outcomes relates to environmental sustainability. So we're really trying to tie this sustainability aspect through to all of the projects that we work with. We're also looking at improving our own performance through carbon measurement and reduction efforts, energy efficient ways of working, and I could go on, but I'm aware of time. And part of this has included dedicating resources to hiring a climate officer to carry out this work, and who's specifically responsible for this, which was good news for me. And some of the specific examples I can give about the work that we're doing is our COP Conversations Fund, the Climate Beacons Ideas Fund, and the Culture COP website we launched to bring all cultural, arts and heritage COP-related events and indeed events related just to wider climate issues to one platform, which I'd encourage you to check out if you wanted to. So now, as I said, now I'll move on to talk about some specific case studies of what museums are doing, just to contextualize all of them. So the first case study I wanted to use was one of the direct actions I was talking about before. So Dumfries and Galloway Aviation Museum applied for funding from our Resilience and Recovery Fund set up in response to COVID, and they used that to fund the installation of a solar panel system to make them a net zero consumer of electricity. Now, this was in response to a tough financial situation that affected all museums, frankly, during COVID, as electricity costs were previously 20% of the fixed costs for this museum. So they thought this was an area that they could make progress in. So the project started at the end of last year, but so far all estimates are positive for the effect of the installation and can demonstrate the effect of the use of renewable energy. I'm sure the message as well of this happening in an aviation museum, with all the impact that aviation has had on climate change and is still having, won't be missed by you guys. But it also demonstrates how important ambition is on the part of the museum. You know, this museum has less than 10 full-time staff, and shows what can be done when ambition is there to take action, what can be achieved in areas which have also suffered economically. So really kind of demonstrates that as long as there's ambition, anybody, any museum, any organization can take action on climate change. So the second case study I wanted to talk about was a more indirect one here, and it's the creation of an ocean-based exhibit called Dive In, which has been housed at Wardlaw Museum in St Andrews, but is a collaboration between a range of partners in and around St Andrews. So what this is it's using an exhibition space at the museum to create an interactive look at the oceans and the issues they face. And it starts from the depths of the oceans and looks at each issue as you rise up into the shallows on the coast and on the land. There's a focus here to look at the issues our oceans face and then tie these to solutions and then to asks and actions each person can do based on their knowledge level. So when somebody enters the museum, they are asked to identify one of 4 levels that they identify with as to their knowledge and commitment level on oceans and climate change. Then as they go around each section, there are asks associated at each level. So if you came to the museum thinking you were starting fresh and wanting to learn, there are suggestions as you go around of the first steps you can take. Whereas if you came in thinking I already know some stuff and do some stuff and want to do more, the asks are more complicated and more complex. So this is the exhibit itself has been designed in collaboration with academics and behavioral analysis consultants, museum staff, and wider climate people to really bring up kind of ocean literacy and climate literacy as people move around the exhibit. And as I say, they've tailored the asks of people to establish knowledge levels, and then there's plans once the exhibit is closed to follow up the experience with visitors and to measure what kind of behavioural impact the exhibit has. And I found it fascinating to see the results. I can't wait. The final case study is of the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, because you can't get a more Scottish museum than that. And also they've undertaken a redevelopment to become a wholly sustainable museum, or as sustainable a museum as they can. And really looking at balancing their conservation needs alongside environmental ones. And it's really ambitious what they've done, and it goes back to the point I made earlier, kind of about how important ambition is, regardless of kind of capacity and resources. Not saying they don't matter, but I'm saying I think ambition is one of the more important things. And for this, so for their green new building, some of the things they've done is include timber cladding from untreated Scottish Douglas fir board, a green roof sown with succulent called sedum, which cools the building during the summer and insulates it in the winter. They've installed a ground source heat pump using pipes to extract the heat from the ground to heat buildings as well as water supplies. There are earth-to-air heat exchangers providing space conditioning throughout the year. There's a thermal mass wall, which absorbs, stores, and releases heat through natural ventilation. And they've also put solar panels attached to glazing installed above the cafe, generating solar energy. So they've really kind of looked at it from a whole of museums operation and identified the areas where they could make progress. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to talk about this more. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Nick Merriman. I'm Chief Executive of the Horniman Museum and Gardens in South London, but I'm speaking to you today in my capacity as Chair of the National Museum Directors Council's Environment and Ecology Group. The NMDC is a group that brings together the directors of all of the UK's national museums, plus all of the larger regional museums, most of whom are also Arts Council NPOs. Now, pretty well all museums are trying in their various ways to reach net zero carbon emissions, to reduce waste, reduce pollution, and increase biodiversity. And we realized, those of us on NMDC, that then at least, we were all working somewhat in isolation and often reinventing the wheel and not sharing enough learning and information. So on the occasion, pretty well exactly 2 years ago, of the Museums Association's conference in Brighton, we set up a little group, working group of the NMDC to focus on environment and ecology. And the ecology bit is important because amidst all of the correct focus on the opportunities afforded by COP26, we mustn't also forget that there is an equivalent biodiversity COP, which is running in parallel. COP15 had its first online meeting in the middle of October, and the second in-person one is happening in April next year in Kunming in China. So, our working group focuses both on biodiversity and on greenhouse gas emissions. What we've done in the last 2 years is in November last year, we had a two half-day online conference bringing together good case studies of current and recent practice. And the contributions from that are all on the NMDC website, if anybody would like to have a look at those. And over the course of the last 2 years, really the work of the group has concentrated on monthly meetings online, because actually the pandemic, as you'll all know, has shown us actually how useful video conferencing tools are for bringing together people scattered all over the country to talk about specific issues. So the monthly meetings tend to have one or two speakers focusing on a particular topic with extensive questions and answers, and then a sort of news round of people attending the meeting, just with updates as to what's going on in their own organisation or sharing any common challenges or questions. So just to give you an example, the last 2 months meetings, one was led by Bella Serino from Tate, who updated people on Tate's very impressive approach to waste reduction and recycling. And the one last month was Nicole Simoes da Silva of Science Museum Group, and also Rachel Kent from Tate, sharing information about their very interesting approaches to virtual couriering, trying to avoid the use of physical people accompanying loans, and looking at the various challenges of trying to do that through video and remote couriering. Doesn't work in all cases, but it's a useful additional tool. So the NMDC Environment and Ecology Group is open to all. You don't have to be an NMDC member museum. And if you'd like to be put on the mailing list for the monthly Zoom meetings, then please get in touch with NMDC staff via the website. For COP26 itself, we're doing a couple of things. There's an NMDC advocacy document called Green Museums, Tackling the Climate Crisis, which will be published in early November with a foreword by Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and adjunct professor for climate change justice at Trinity College Dublin. And the document contains case studies of NMDC museums' work on research, on public engagement, and on greening their operations. It's going to be shared with NMDC members, government, and other key stakeholders as an advocacy document, as well as being published on the NMDC website alongside additional case studies of best practice across the membership. So do look out for that. And on the 2nd of November, we're partnering with the American Association of Museums Climate and Environment Network, with ICOM's Working Group on Sustainability, and with the National Nordic Museum in the USA, to deliver a virtual symposium called On the Front Line, Arctic Museums and Climate Change, which is showing how museums in and about the Arctic are experiencing in very real terms the impacts of the melting of ice and permafrost, the consequent flooding, and by contrast, the rise in wildfires. The symposium, so the UK is involved because of the UK's and specifically Scotland's hosting of COP26. So there's going to be an introduction by Chris Breward, Director of National Museum Scotland, and then a keynote by Jago Cooper and Amber Lincoln of the British Museum on the BM's recent Arctic exhibition. And then the symposium will have speakers from museums in and around the Arctic, particularly highlighting Indigenous voices. So again, if you're interested, registration for this free symposium on the 2nd of November can be found on the NMDC website. And finally, in relation to COP, as chair of the working group, I've also written a lead editorial, which will be published in the Art newspaper, on the role of museums and galleries in tackling the climate crisis. The COP is obviously a great focus for museums and galleries around their carbon reduction work and so on. But what then are the post-COP activities? For the NMDC group, we're following up last year's conference with we hope, an in-person 2-day conference, bringing together further examples of thinking, good practice, and so on. And we think if we can do it, it's really important that we bring in that in-person informal networking that we've all been missing so much during the pandemic. And that's going to be held in January in Manchester, chosen because it's the first industrial city and therefore also the first city of climate change. The people who get involved in our working group and the conferences tend understandably to be those whose day-to-day jobs focus very much on trying to deliver net zero and waste reduction and so on. So it tends to be estates and facilities and sustainability people, but also curators and educators interested in engaging the public. But we also think it's really important that the directors of museums are fully engaged in this, the challenge of the climate crisis. So we're planning a dedicated NMDC session of the directors of the 14 museums sometime early next year, focusing on what we might collectively do post-COP. And this, we hope, might lead to some form of collective publication or advice looking at museum-specific issues. There's already a very extensive literature and series of advice from Julie's Bicycle or from the Green Theatres group on managing buildings, reducing waste, etc., etc. But there isn't so much detailed advice on museum and gallery specific issues like engaging wide publics in a positive and active way, developing sustainable exhibitions, loans, couriering, transport, etc., collection storage in a sustainable way, and approaches to collaborative offsetting. So we very much hope that COP will be the driver for further detailed and collaborative work for the national and regional museums. And that will set the agenda for the next few months. So I hope that's been of interest. Thank you for listening.
Over the last year at Amgueddfa Cymru National Museum Wales, we've been developing a carbon literacy training course. The course was accredited by the Carbon Literacy Project back in April, and we've been rolling it out to all staff across our 8 sites. The course covers the facts of what climate change is and what's happening both globally and at home. It is produced by museum people for museum people. Over 100 staff have already received their carbon literacy certificates, and we're aiming to roll out the rest of the training to remaining staff over the next year. We've just received bronze level carbon literate organisation status, and we're hoping to go for silver level shortly. The response from staff has been absolutely amazing, and we've been really uplifted by the pledges people have made. The pledges have been really varied, dealing from instance tackling digital carbon footprints, travel policies in order to make our travel more sustainable, energy, resource use, developing workshops, exhibitions and social media campaigns in order to talk about climate change and empower others into action. We've talked about fast fashion and dietary requirements as well. A whole plethora of different pledges. We've really enjoyed our journey for carbon literacy, and it's just part of what Amgueddfa Cymru is doing towards carbon neutrality. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, Christian. First of all, tell us, why do we need air conditioning in museums?
We need air conditioning for the preservation of collections. There are a lot of materials that cultural heritage collections are made of are very sensitive to environmental conditions. Some will respond to temperature changes. A very large number will also respond to humidity fluctuations. So if you think of wood, for example, wood swells when the humidity is high and it shrinks when the humidity is low. And these sort of shrink and swell cycles can cause cracking and damage to any object that is made of wood. And indeed, many other organic materials are what we call hygroscopic, so they absorb and desorb moisture from the air in the either in the room or outside.
So does that mean then that there is a strong link between collections care and energy use in museums?
That is historically, yes, I think that has been the case. So in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of museums around the world have started introducing air conditioning equipment. And the purpose of this equipment was the realization at the time, and going back further, indeed, that damage as a result of these sort of shrink and swell cycles can happen and has happened. And we've lost heritage objects as a result of environmental fluctuations, or they've been damaged and needed extensive repair. Because we're trying to avoid repairs as much as possible, we essentially try to stabilize environmental conditions along with any other factors that could potentially cause deterioration of cultural heritage. So there are these famous 10 agents of deterioration, which include things like temperature, humidity, light, physical damage. And because it is generally a lot better to prevent damage than to fix it, air conditioning in many museums is an important part of preventive conservation. Now, because this requires an awful lot of energy input, there is currently still a very strong link between the preservation of collections, by which in this instance we mean the stabilization of environmental conditions, because you're fighting essentially against often unnatural conditions. So in the winter, certainly in temperate latitudes, we heat the buildings, which then drives down the humidity. And so in addition to the heating, we also have to then spend energy on humidification to bring the humidity up to the level where we want it to be. And in the summer, it's the other way around. We tend to cool buildings, which then actually increases the humidity. So we're then expanding additional energy on dehumidification. And this is something that has been manifested really in the past 40 years in many museums.
There are great examples of building refurbishments and new builds to passive house standards in the heritage sector. So for example, there's Herefordshire Archives and Record Centre, there's the Whitworth. Does that mean that good environmental practice in museums has to start with major capital investments?
Yes, both these examples are actually amazing in terms of one was a new build, the other one a building refurbishment and addition to the existing building. That is obviously a really nice and neat way of demonstrating energy savings and sustainability. There are other ways as well, and they are perhaps not as headline making as large-scale redevelopments with big developer input and large budgets. But it is entirely possible to achieve similar savings by just chipping away at regular maintenance of the facilities management in buildings. So this would include on a domestic level, you're like, okay, I'm looking at my house and I'm trying to save energy. So I'm excluding drafts and I'm increasing insulation. Before then perhaps attempting to tackle the central heating boiler and replacing it with a newer, more efficient one, perhaps a different technology, replacing lighting. We can do exactly the same sort of thing in museums, and in fact, in my previous role at National Museum Cardiff, this is what we've been trying to do over the past decade, if not perhaps almost 15 years now. And the cumulative energy savings you can achieve in that way are absolutely astonishing.
Okay, so tell us how much carbon emissions and money you saved at National Museum Cardiff.
We started out in the early 2000s with a really high baseline of energy use. And by baseline, I mean kind of the energy that the building uses when it's not occupied, so in the nights. And you can see if you look at energy data of a building, it's really hard hitting of how much energy a building can consume when there's really nobody in it. What we were trying to look at initially was replacing lighting throughout. Lighting is really important in museums, an awful lot of lamps in heritage organizations. And the switch to LED has a dramatic impact on not just lighting, but also the avoiding heat output from lamps. The traditional incandescent bulbs or fluorescent lamps, halogen tungsten lamps, have a very low efficiency of converting electricity to light. A lot of the electricity is actually converted to heat, and the LEDs avoid that. So by actually replacing lighting with LED, not only are you reducing the amount of energy that you use directly, but also indirectly in terms of requiring less cooling in the building to remove all of that heat load back out of the building. And that started that process of replacing lighting with LEDs in Cardiff started in the late 2000s, so probably about 2007, 2008. There were then additional projects that we started tackling, looking at the facilities management. And a few years ago, the humidifiers as well as the chillers were replaced in Cardiff. There was also a combined heat power plant installed, which produces heat, hot water, essentially provides hot water for the building, but as a byproduct, if you want, also produces electricity. So you're using a lot less gas for the same unit of energy that you're putting into the plant. And the cumulative savings from all of these projects, and there were others as well, replacing valves, for instance, with that can be regulated electronically, variable fan speeds, and all of these sort of things accumulated about 2/3 of electricity savings per year. So that is an enormous amount. And just by looking at humidifiers, for example, the building has approximately 50 humidifiers. And when we replaced those, just those alone, the electricity savings alone amounted to about 100,000 kilowatt hours per year. So that at the time equated to about £90,000 per year, per annum, at electricity costs at the time. We know that electricity costs have gone up, so the current saving will be a lot larger. That was just one element. And there is a capital cost, of course. The whole project was financed with generous help from an investment to save scheme by government, which is a loan, so the money has to be repaid over a number of years from the savings, essentially. Once you've repaid the loan, the organization essentially makes an enormous financial saving.
You said you started in the early 2000s, so it's taken quite a long time to implement this.
Yes, that is correct. You have to, these sort of things, rather than the capital projects, which are sometimes big hitters over a couple of years, these sort of schemes, looking at the facilities management, you have to be in it for the long haul. This kind of assumes a consistency of staff, perhaps, people who know what they're doing, or alternatively, perhaps a really good vision for the organization to ensure that this is absolutely embedded into the organizational management.
What did the facilities management think of this approach? Was it entirely new then?
It wasn't entirely new to our facilities management. The facilities manager at National Museum Wales, Gareth Jones, actually, him and I developed a very close relationship when we started planning some of these projects, and there were mutual benefits essentially that we could both see. And he brought a lot of the technical expertise, and I was coming in from the point of view of conservation, of course. In a sense, the technical solutions are all out there. There are perhaps in my experience in other museums, not every facilities manager has those solutions at their fingertips. But Gareth was very proactive at suggesting new and additional solutions, and he's constantly still generating lots of new ideas. And in that sense, we also, the technical staff at the museum were also involved in this process, because they could also see the maintenance benefits of using new approaches, essentially. So some aspects of maintaining really outdated air conditioning systems are incredibly maintenance intensive. These things break down all the time, and then the conservators start shouting that the conditions are out of spec again. It pulls away resources from other projects that you're trying to do, other work. And once we started introducing some of these elements, the maintenance requirement actually of the air conditioning systems plummeted dramatically. So there was an enormous time saving. From Gareth's point of view, there was a huge, obviously the enormous financial savings to his budget. From my point of view in conservation, suddenly the reliability of the entire system increased really quite dramatically. So we were really struggling in some display galleries, public galleries, and collection stores to hit our environmental targets to keep collections safe. And once we'd installed some of these new systems, we hit 95% of our targets pretty much straight away. So there were multiple benefits to everybody involved, essentially.
So it sounds as if there was also a successful effect on environmental control from a collections care point of view as well.
Absolutely, and that was, while I have a very strong interest in sustainable development, professionally, from a professional point of view, the improvements in the reliability of our environmental management obviously was for me one of the top objectives, and we really managed to meet those. There is perhaps, in relation to on the humidification front anyway, but also to give an example for the LEDs, we had one gallery that had perhaps 50 or 60 tungsten halogen light bulbs fitted in it as part of the gallery lighting. We were always struggling to control temperature, in particular in this gallery. It's quite a small space. Once we'd replaced all of those lamps with LEDs, temperature management was never an issue again. And the existing air conditioning plant, which for many years had been planned to be replaced, which would be really quite expensive, and then essentially in that case you would have these really expensive lamps in there, plus a really expensive air conditioning plant. But by just replacing the lamps, actually, we managed to avoid replacing the air conditioning, and saved an awful lot of money in both capital costs as well as running costs, and stabilize the environmental conditions. So it's that there are really sort of multiple benefits to these kinds of approaches.
This doesn't sound quick fixes. Does this mean you have to be in it for the long haul? And how can other organisations ensure the consistency that this requires?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's not a quick fix. I'm talking about a time period of about 12 to 15 years here now, and improvements are still continuing. if we're talking in terms of the urgency of the climate emergency, you know, we're really having to ramp up our efforts. But some of these projects have a larger impact than others. So it is possible to focus on some of these elements and really make the majority of savings in a relatively short period of time. But others will just take longer just by their very nature. And the way to ensure consistency is, I think, consistency of staff is one element that is really quite crucial. But if the organization has a robust vision, and this is something that they really want to do, and it is not just tied to individual staff being present, then I think this is something that's that can be achieved as well, even with staff turnover. What perhaps needs to happen is actually a greater awareness of how much the effect really, and the multiple beneficial effects of this approach are on both the heritage preservation, the conservation side, as well as on the energy management and the financial resources of the organisation.
Doing this in a large organisation is one thing, but how would smaller museums with much smaller budgets achieve similar results?
That is a really interesting question. I mean, I'm coming from the point of view of a large national museum with, you know, relatively good central control of facilities management. I do also have experience in local museums, and I do know that in the cases of many local museums, the facilities management is sitting somewhere else. Perhaps if you're the council-run museum, then the estates services will be entirely different council department, and you know, people don't always talk to each other. That perhaps requires a little bit of cooperation between these different services, and again, awareness raising. There are approaches possible, and the facilities managers actually have their own organization as well that looks at sustainable developments, and it is perhaps a matter of the museum itself, if he wants to achieve these kinds of improvements, to sit down with the facilities managers and talk these things through. So there's a lot about relationship building and awareness raising.
Finally, what are you planning on doing next?
I've recently started a new job at National Museums Liverpool, and I'm currently planning to bring my experience into this organisation and try to achieve the same benefits up here. There are very typically similar situations, and they're multiplied across museums up and down the country and in other countries. So there is potential for energy savings and improving environmental conditions at the same time in Liverpool as in many other museums as well. So we started working together with the Estates Department at National Museums Liverpool, as well as the sustainability task force that we have in the organisation, to try and implement a similar programme of modernisation and improvements.
Thank you, and thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you, it's been my pleasure.
Hi, Debbie. Thanks for talking to us about home and its environmental commitments. Firstly, tell us a bit about yourself and home.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. So yes, so I'm the Building and Environmental Manager at Home since it opened in 2015. Prior to that, I worked at the organisation down the road at Cornerhouse Cinema. So yeah, it's been a 16-year plus journey for myself and the organisation on environmental sustainability. We have been a carbon literacy platinum organisation since 2015, and we were the first arts organisation in the world to have all our staff trained in carbon literacy, which is a great achievement.
That's brilliant. So I know that Home has set itself targets to reduce carbon emissions. Could you tell us about those targets and some of the ways that you are working to meet them?
Sure, so our targets are in line with Manchester's targets, which is to be a zero carbon city by 2038. There's an interim target to be 50% reduction by 2025. That's on direct emissions. So for a business like ours, that's on travel, which is the audience travel, our business travel, our staff commuting, and then the energy. So you can imagine in a building like ours, that's quite significant. But actually for us, travel is the biggest carbon footprint of a business. So yeah, it needs to kind of really take forward how we talk to our audiences, our staff. So we're obviously doing this with carbon literacy with our teams, but we have a little short film that we show to our audiences, pre-cinema screenings, on our website and around our building to let them know actually this is our carbon footprint and we're on this journey with you and we'd like you to take your part to help us to reduce our carbon footprint.
We're going to show that video at the end of this interview. So you've mentioned carbon literacy training. I know you've been working with the Carbon Literacy Project. Home has been delivering a lot of carbon literacy training in the past few years. So can you tell us a bit about the training you've been delivering and the impact that it's had?
Yeah, it's had a huge impact on an organisation such as Home. You know, how do you reduce the carbon footprint of a brand new building when you don't have a benchmark? So for us, we piloted in line with MAST, the carbon literacy training into the organisation. So 100% of our staff are trained in carbon literacy and all our new starters within 6 months of starting in the organisation. It's allowed our staff to commit to influence and sustain positive change. So we have lots of outcomes and actions. It gives people an awareness, it allows people to influence. And all our actions are logged in our organisation and we work on them as a traffic light system. So red, we should be doing something now with that action. Amber, it might need a little bit of time and investment. So it comes next. And then green, it's something we need to plan for the future. But all those actions and that action plan does stay live.
So Home is also part of MAST, which you'd mentioned. So that's the Manchester Arts Sustainability Team. Can you tell us more about the partnership and what that has meant to Home being a part of that?
Yeah, sure, I can. So Home has been part of MAST since day one. And it's fantastically now going to be known as Greater Manchester because that's who we are. We're not just one city, we are the 10 authorities. We're a collective of over 50 arts organisations in the Greater Manchester area who share best practice and always have done. And for us, we're less than 2% of a carbon footprint of a city, yet we have the loudest voices as cultural sector. So yeah, you know, we need to work together. It's the one thing we have in common. We're never going to show the same show in a theatre, but we've obviously got something in common to do with the reduction of sustainability. So yeah, we've piloted projects through MAST, as mentioned, carbon literacy. So we did a MAST 100. We trained 100 MAST members. And we've written not just Home's carbon literacy package, but we've written a package for MAST. So MAST can take that on now and move forward. We've collectively worked with Walk the Plank on carbon literacy, Manchester City Council through MAST. We've written a volunteers package that's now being delivered across the city. And URBACT, which is a European best sharing practice, which we also saw ourselves deliver carbon literacy to those guys. And really it's just about getting together with like-minded people, knowing you can all make a difference together.
It's been 10 years since Culture convened to respond to Manchester's first climate change policy, and I want to share the experience we've had of working together. A collaborative journey started that would see the development of a regional network that later became MAST, a community within the cultural sector learning and sharing experience with each other. Right from the beginning, our ethos was that this was a collective challenge that we had to meet by working together, that we would share each other's success, whether that was gaining knowledge or developing practice, and that we would approach our impact as a sector and embrace local targets. As the years rolled by, the momentum and commitment grew and our impact reduced. Remarkable that all of this happened through a period of considerable funding reduction for our city and sector. Also, there began to emerge some incredible engagement projects, and they now form a regular part of many organisations' programming. Culture bringing stories to life that are meaningful in our communities and helping develop that all-important emotional connection that drives action. After 5 years, we were a much larger group, including art centres, theatres, museums, galleries, festivals, broadcasters, music venues, production companies, and more, exploring the challenges and meeting them together. Ultimately, we became involved in city policy developments, and little did we know how unusual that was, culture and climate working together. In 2018, Manchester's good practice was recognised by the EU's URBAC programme, its focus driving change for better cities. It presented the MAST model and its contribution to the city's climate change policies, and we began to explore how we could share what we'd learned. The project ultimately became known as Sea Change, and it would run across 3 years, and it brought together Manchester and 5 other European cities. And it was a different kind of project because it involved city administrations and their culture sector to network, collaborate, and then shape action together. All the cities were very different, but all have culture at their heart. In most cases, because we were visiting, it was the very first time that culture and environment had been asked how they could work together. The project had 4 main strands: collaboration between city and sector, support from the city and the tools and skills to explore environmental action, policy, understanding climate change targets and getting involved in developing them, and engagement, looking at how culture can be in conversation with communities and generate meaningful activities to connect us on climate. And the results of the project have been kind of amazing. All of the cities have changed how they're connecting climate and culture and with each other. And culture has become involved in developing local policy and strategy, but most importantly, creating community engagement through cultural activities. MAST is part of what's known as the Manchester Climate Change Partnership. It's a sector-led approach directing the work of our local climate change agency, the The University of Manchester participates, as does MMU, and local networks focusing on health and well-being, social housing, faith come together with the City Council, business, the airport, football club, and the power network operator for the Northwest. There's also a youth board. The model provides new connections in the city and brings sectors together who might not have collaborated. With academic learning at the heart of evolving strategy, it helps us define future focus. And recent projects have included exploring consumption-based emissions and adaptation and resilience planning. Many minds, many perspectives, great thinkers and great communicators. As a cultural network, we've looked hard at the barriers to action and developed some resources to help instill the confidence to build a more sustainable approach into cultural practice. Cultural organisations that are part of higher education are an amazing knowledge bridge. Some organisations are well on their journey, others just starting out, but our ethos for the network remains the same. We're in this together. This is our response to local climate targets. The blue are areas of focus for any cultural organisation, and I'll whiz through them quickly. Understanding policy and our position within the carbon budget, planning further reduction, engaging with people, reducing the impact of cultural places and changing our practice. And around them, the strengths our sector brings to help imagine, inspire, inform, innovate and include. We think that's the biggest impact we can have. Culture as convener, ambassador, placemaker, and part of the health and well-being of our communities of all ages, advocating, demonstrating, and a safe space to explore our feelings, a great place to examine our fixation on consumption and embrace other models. And we look forward to working more closely with the wealth of knowledge in our city region. A decade after we started, we now bring together more than 50 cultural organisations working across the city region, and we've become GMAS because we're greater together. And we're seeing more networks like ours emerge and exploring how we can work together across the north. And our online home that you can see the link to shares our practice and resources for this city and beyond. Climate change is a global issue that also requires understanding and action at a local level. None of us can tackle this alone. It is perhaps our greatest collective endeavour. As recognised now in national policy, when culture and science come together, the results can be amazing. Thanks.
We are in a climate and environmental emergency. The COP26 meeting in Glasgow is critical to how we respond. This is not just about government commitments, this is about sectors and professions and individuals all playing their part. IIC is now making a climate action commitment, and we're doing this with ICCROM and ICOM-CC because, as three of the leading international bodies within the conservation sector for cultural heritage, we all care deeply about making transformative change happen and walking the talk.
We are joining forces with IIC and ICCROM to form a coalition aimed at mobilising the international cultural heritage sector and contributing towards the global agenda for action on climate change. Through this joint commitment for climate action, we can implement transformative actions that will help tackle carbon emissions, achieve a carbon net zero future, and support the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
Dear colleagues, as the level of urgency in the climate crisis continues to rise, we need to ask ourselves, are we doing enough? The time is now to put words into action. For ICCROM, This starts at home. We are committed to reducing our carbon footprint within our operations by shifting to greener energy sources and greener suppliers, offsetting carbon emissions, and embedding climate action and awareness into everything we do.
Our actions have impact and consequence. Together, as a professional body, we can make change. Change is needed to combat and mitigate the current climate crisis that we are all facing. Altering our working practices, our selection of materials, our ways of thinking will have impact, especially if we do this as a community. We hope that this collaborative commitment will have far-reaching reverberations and inspire you to put change into action. ICOMCC will be organising future events and activities to provide you with tools to change, and we will invite our members to engage with these efforts, share ideas, and help us take action and save both our planet and our cultural heritage.
This commitment will carry through to the activities and services we offer to our member states. Our projects are designed to contribute concretely to the Sustainable Development Goals and a better world. Our work looks at climate change in two ways: how heritage is affected by it and how heritage can help us tackle it. For example, by contributing to reduce climate-related disaster risk and to build resilience in communities. We link heritage management and protection with nature conservation. We address the pressures of urbanization on culture and work to change mindsets at a policy level and on the ground. We believe in the profound connection cultural heritage has to thriving societies and human well-being. Heritage is a powerful tool, but a fragile one. Let's embark on this journey of commitment together.
Thank you for supporting this joint commitment for climate action.
We are not called a passion profession without good cause. We work in the world of conservation because that is what we're passionate about and committed to. 279 warm words will not in themselves achieve action. But this is a commitment that acknowledges our responsibility as an international body and our role working with others to drive the changes we need to ultimately bring down emissions in our sector and to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees. This is our call for climate action, and we commit to leading by example. Thank you.
The Tables Turned by William Wordsworth. Up, up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this toil and trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening lustre mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife. Come, hear the woodland linnet. How sweet his music! On my life, there's more of wisdom in it. And hark, how blithe the throstle sings. He too is no mean preacher. Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless. Spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Sweet is the law which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous form of things. We murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives.